Welcoming to our program, Rich Noyes, Director of Research for the Media Research Center. Rich, we thank you for Skyping in today. And let's just begin with the obvious question. Are we seeing a media bias in the United States against Israel?
Well, I think so. I think the longer this conflict goes on, the more it's going to be defined by these pictures of civilian destruction, Palestinian suffering, and it's making Israel look like a big bad bully, and you lose more and more of the context about how, rockets have been fired in Israel's directions. They were intended to kill as many civilians as have been killed on the other side. They're just not as effective. And somehow Israel is being blamed for the fact that they're able to defend their population, whereas Hamas is letting their population suffer with these attacks. I think you had a commentator on MSNBC, one of their hosts, actually said he thought the media were doing a better job in this conflict compared to others because Israel is losing the media war. Well, some people, that is the test of whether the media coverage is good or not. I think the media coverage needs to be fair, not anti-Israel.
Now, aside from MSNBC, and there are a number of examples out there, and we'll get to those, what other media outlets would you say, Rich, have been some of the most egregious in this area?
Well, I think all the broadcast networks, over time, I think in the beginning, the first few days of this, remember this began with Israeli teenagers being kidnapped and eventually being found dead. That there was more even-handed coverage in those first few days. But I think as the death toll's risen on the Palestinian side, all three broadcast networks last Thursday, for example, covered the attack on a school with terrible consequences, but never pointed out in their evening newscast that night that the Hamas have been using schools like that to store their rockets. Well, if you don't include that context, this is, I think, the grievance that the Israeli ambassador had. You're making it seem as if it's sort of reckless on Israel's part, as if it's careless on their part, as if they're trying to deliberately target civilians. And I think that is missing the point. I think our media need to do some work at peeling back the strategy on the Hamas side, which is they don't have superior weapons, they don't have a superior military force. What is their strategy? Their strategy is to use these images, to use world public opinion to defeat Israel where they can't defeat it militarily. Media coverage that accentuates exactly what Hamas wants is helping this kind of a cynical strategy and rewarding it.
What would you say, though, to opponents that say, by far, we have covered more stories that are pro-Israel versus Palestinian stories? I mean, in decades, they have been covering more Israeli officials versus Palestinian officials. What would you say to those reporters who say that? Are you saying this is a new thing, or? I
think it's a relatively new thing. I think, if you go back in the 1970s, 1980s, even the 1990s, I think there was a much more pro-Israel bent in the media. But somehow, over the last couple of decades, it's shifted. And I think now the Palestinians are seen much more as victims of Israel. The media, I think, are much more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than they were decades ago when there was a lot, much more in-your-face terrorism. I mean, part of this is Israel's success. Israel used to suffer terrible terrorist attacks, in their discotheques, on their buses. Then they basically figured out a way to use defensive measures to keep those to an absolute minimum. Well, this has actually helped their population, helped them live more securely. But in terms of this international media war, which is really, again, very, very cynical, they don't have the sort of images of cruelty inflicted on their population, even though, the other side wants to do that. They're just thwarted at doing it.
Well, Rich, John mentioned MSNBC a few minutes ago, and a very interesting a bit of tape we want to play for you. Young Blue Eyes, MSNBC host Ronan Farrow had network contributor Rula Jabril on his program to discuss this situation. Ms. Jabril spent over a minute claiming American media is, quote, disgustingly biased against Palestinians. Let's take a listen to part of what she had to say.
We are ridiculous. We are disgustingly biased when it comes to this issue. Look at how many airtime Netanyahu and his folks have on air on a daily basis. Andrea Mitchell and others. I never seen one Palestinian being interviewed on these same issues.
Well, I'll push on back on that a little. We've had Palestinian
maybe for
voices
30 seconds, and then you have 25 minutes for Bibi Netanyahu and half an hour for Naftali Bennett and many others.
So, Rich, let me ask you, is there truth to what she's saying?
Well, I do think the Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Israeli ambassador, they've gotten a lot of exposure on U.S. media. But I think, what you're not getting Hamas officials very much. There was one interview on CBS. You're getting some Palestinian spokespeople from the West Bank. But what you're getting are individuals. You're getting victims. I mean, this is the face Hamas wants to put forward. This morning on NBC, there was a teenage girl who said she wasn't a Hamas supporter now, but now with all the destruction, she loves Hamas because they're sending their rockets to attack Israel. I mean, that is the Palestinian side, and there was no Israeli similar talking head among their citizens. So I think it's simply a reflection of the way the two sides are doing it. And I think the general tone of this coverage is they're defining this by the lopsided death toll. I think this is something we've had to face too when we fought these same kinds of battles overseas, that somehow, because American casualties are so low, it's somehow not a fair fight. Well, we're not supposed to have a high casualty among our side. We're supposed to be inflicting on the other side. I think Israel's suffering the same media effect that the U.S. did when we were fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, Rich Noyes, we do appreciate your time. We'll have to leave it there. Rich Noyes, the Director of Research for the Media Research Center, thank you for sharing some of that research and your opinions with us. So, what are your opinions of the press coverage? Fair to Israel? Unfair to the Palestinians? Disjointed in both ways? Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, hashtag America's Forum. Email us what's on your mind at newsmaxtv.com/comment. And don't forget Facebook.